Hello and welcome to Off the Shelf Reviews. I'm Gary and today we're going to take a look at The Unnamable, which came out in 1988, written, produced and directed by Jean-Paul Ouellette. Now there have been quite a few H.P. Lovecraft adaptations over the last 5 decades or so, going all the way back to The Haunted Palace, which came out in 1963, directed by Roger Corman. You even had The Dunwich Horror in 1970, directed by Daniel Haller. Of course, probably the most successful or most well-known adaptation is The Reanimator, which came out in 1985, directed by Stuart Gordon. Stuart Gordon would follow the success of The Reanimator up with From Beyond in 1986. We also had The Necronomicon, which was an anthology series in 1994. You had Dagon in 2001, which was also by Stuart Gordon. And even more recently, you had The Colour Out of Space, which is the third or fourth time that's been adapted. And that was actually probably the best adaptation visually in terms of high budget filmmaking out of all of the adaptations to date. But we're going to take a trip back to 1987 where this film was made, and I believe it was shot in about 3 weeks on a tiny budget of $350,000. But the beginning of our story takes place in 18th century Arkham. We start on the exterior of an old house and a kind of fake-looking cemetery with wonky-looking tombstones, which actually has the names Carter inscribed on one of them. There's even a Winthrop tombstone just to clue you in as to where you are. You hear the screams over the thunderstorm, and you see an old man trying to calm down something off screen. You get a kind of a POV shot as he locks this whimpering lady in an attic. The old man is into some kind of occultish books, but the screams in the attic continue. He unlocks the attic and you get the POV shot as he gets his heart ripped out. Yeah, that was pretty decent death. And then we cut to the day after, where a priest and some locals have found the body and decide to bury him right outside. After all, it is Arkham's cemetery. So Mr. Kraft, the priest, quickly decides that we need to bury the body and seal this house up and never let anybody in here ever again. We then cut some 100 years later as Carter is telling the story of 50 years past, that an unnamable creature's face was captured in the glass in the reflection of the window because she stared out of it for years. Carter tells the story of the team that found it and went absolutely crazy and was locked up in Arkham as he could not describe the thing that he saw in the house.
But Joe, there are things in this universe that are so horrific that the human mind is unable to conceive of them.
Wrong. Everything can be conceived and described, either through scientific prose or mathematical equation.
And that is a smug answer, Joe.
Randolph Carter's played by Mark Kinsey Stephenson, and he's talking to Howard, played by Charles Klausmeyer, and Joel, a scientist and skeptic, played by Mark Para. All of these are students from the Miskatonic University, and they talk about science versus legend and what can be perceived when they are suddenly attacked.
There is a third local tale that tells...
Whoa! 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 Give it! God! That's a bat!
Of course, Carter he's into folklore, and he's kind of also unsure about whether the events in the house are true or not, as he explains that, yeah, folklore, as it gets passed down the generations, it gets embellished, and you can't really believe everything that is said there. But Joel, he's the skeptic, he's the scientist. He's just like, no, it's ridiculous, it's silly. So he decides he's going to investigate the house. Carter and Howard decide that they're not interested.
Scientific inquiry is the ultimate road, Carter.
To famous disasters. And I, for one, will not risk tampering with forces that dangerous.
So Randolph and Howard return to the Miskatonic University, and they continue the discussion about the validity of legends and their origins in history when Wendy Barnes pushes past them. Wendy is played by Laura Albert, who's only really appeared in a couple of films after this one. She is a massive stunt performer and has worked on over 150 films.
See ya.
Howard at this point pursues Wendy, who kind of shrugs him off like he's a creep. She doesn't like that Howard's kind of stalking her through the Miskatonic University. Even though he's only offering to walk her home, she's really not interested. But then we cut back to Joel, who is still outside the house. Yeah, he's been out there this whole time trying to figure out how to get in. But the house set, when he does get inside, is awesome. You got these dust-covered relics and cobwebs and peeling wallpaper, and it's all bathed in this blue moonlight. But then you get the kind of typical horror tropes where he's wandering around going, "Hey, is that you? This isn't funny. I'm not scared." He wanders around in some candlelight, and you get a shadow of the creature passing by with a growl. And of course the skeptic's like, "Hey, what have I got to be afraid of?" Joel goes into the attic and sees the locked door and the face in the glass.
Uh-oh.
And he gets his guts ripped out from off screen. Don't really get to see the creature, but you definitely hear it. And it's kind of a tame death, but, there's plenty of blood. We cut to the next day, and Howard enters the university to see Carter and explains that Joel hasn't come back. Wendy and her friend also stop by and were introduced to Tanya Heller, played by Alexandra Durrell. Howard really wants to go and look for his friend Joel, but Carter convinces him it's just a prank. It's also clear to see here that Tanya has a crush on Howard, but Wendy explains you've got to use your head to get ahead.
You have to use what you've got to get ahead, if you know what I mean. I guess. What do you mean?
But then we get introduced to the Miskatonic University Official Welcome Committee. John Babcock, played by Blaine Wheatley, and Bruce Weeks, played by Eben Ham. They convince the girls to go with them in scoping out a location for the freshman fraternity initiation.
All right, but no frat pranks.
No pranks. Honest.
We'll see.
John and Bruce arrive at the house, excited to get the girls scared and horny. But the girls try to get the jump scare on the guys before they venture into the house. And then the door slams closed, but it was just Bruce. But soon though, they find tracks leading up the stairs, as if somebody was here before them.
Look, Bruce, I suggest we find a good spot to get our attitudes adjusted.
They start to explore and scare each other a bit before Tanya realizes they are actually locked in. The door won't open. Meanwhile, someone is stalking Carter. Howard literally just jumps out of nowhere and explains that Joel still hasn't turned up, and he's not turned up where he was actually supposed to be. And so this is when Carter decides he'll actually help his friend.
Well, it's about time.
It's urban legend story time back at the Winthrop house, though, as they tell the familiar story of the corpse hanging above the car. This time it's his bleeding fingernails that are scraping across the top. But Wendy quickly gets bored of this old story and decides that she wants to do some more exploring, if you know what I mean. They explore another room before a rat scares them off. They head upstairs and continue to look around. No dead bodies hiding under here. Wendy and John decide to run off from the others, while Bruce attempts to convince Tanya to scare them. But she's really not interested in him, and they both back into a room and fail to notice the hanging, dripping corpse in the corner of the room. Of course, Wendy and John find another room after more exploring, and slowly stumbling around the house before disappearing behind a closed door. And then we're back to POV monster time as the Unnamable stalks the teens through the house. Wendy and John have found a nice spot to relax when Wendy gets boned from behind by a large broken bone.
Some animal must have dragged us in.
An animal that big I don't need.
What about me?
Well, it depends on how big you are.
Meanwhile, Bruce is heavily trying to corner Tanya, who is still not interested. And this is intercut with the sexy time, which also gets interrupted with head. A severed head. That of Joel from the beginning of the movie. Wendy, of course, runs off screaming while the others try to find her. And when they do, she screams and faints.
What got into her?
Probably your stupid friend.
John falls victim to the Unnamable next in a pretty gruesome neck gouging. In a panic to escape, we get the first glimpse of the Unnamable 51 minutes into the film. But only Tanya makes it to the front door, and when it opens, shadows emerge, and she faints.
Just like a woman to faint. Take care of her, Howard.
I really like the character of Randall, and yeah, I got nothing for that. Carter leaves Howard to attend Tanya while he examines the house. Tanya soon comes around and explains about the deaths and the creature, and Carter still doesn't quite believe in it. After some discussion, Tanya enlists Howard in searching for Wendy, whilst Carter contemplates the possibility that maybe a monster is loose, or maybe it's just a psychopath, or that it is still Joel and it's just a very good prank. The Unnamable separates Bruce and Wendy before knocking Bruce to the ground and then repeatedly bashes his head into the ground, and then drags his corpse away. Tanya and Howard share a moment when Wendy emerges from under a bloody tablecloth, and we get a few shots of monster feet. And then the Unnamable chases her through the house. Carter at this point also discovers the Necronomicon and starts reading through his pages. Now, we've seen the Necronomicon turn up in countless other movies, and how many good things happen when you find that book? Well, this book's actually not too bad, because Carter is able to blow out the candles, reignite the candles, and open the front door. Kind of menial tasks for the Necronomicon. It's also here where we get probably the funniest or the most out of place bit of dialogue in the film, where Tanya and Howard continue to search, and Tanya has to ask, what did the other guy see in Wendy?
It's her big tits, isn't it?
I guess.
Damn.
And so Howard tries to get Carter to help him, but he needs more time to understand what it is that they're facing as he pours through the rest of the pages of the book. The girl screaming upstairs forces Howard to go and try and find them. But then we get a flashback, a kind of diary entry by Joshua Winthrop, where he explains a spell was used to trap an evil within the walls of the house. Apparently Winthrop used, or attempted to use, the aid of old tree spirits in order to contain the beast in the house. Howard continues his search for the girls and ventures into the basement to find a hole in the wall when a deranged Wendy attacks him and accuses him of being the killer, as she always believed that Howard was stalking her. But he tries to convince her otherwise, and she attacks him again, almost killing him when the Unnamable breaks her neck and then drags her off through the hole in the wall. Howard, at this point, has also fainted. Carter leaves the house after unlocking the front door, where he heads outside and lifts one of the tombs before attempting to climb into it. But a rat squeak sound effect kind of frightens him off. And so Carter starts reading aloud from the book again, and then actually descends and disappears into the tomb. This is where Howard then awakens in the basement and starts stumbling around upstairs to try and find Carter, who's vanished, and then Tanya, who's also vanished. We find Tanya crawling around in the cobwebs when she discovers the remains of John. Howard follows the screams and finds her when the Unnamable drops Bruce to the ground, again, to pursue them. They race up to the attic and try to seal the door that's falling apart, when Tanya finds another room with a hole leading somewhere else in the house, which they also start to seal. Meanwhile, Carter is reading aloud the spells or the diary entries of Joshua Winthrop regarding the tree spirits when things get a little bit shaky. Howard and Tanya, still remaining trapped in the house, find the reflected face in the window, which this time actually turns out to be the Unnamable herself, who smashes her way inside, launching herself at Howard after letting out a blood-curdling scream. Howard gets slashed up, both are thrown across the room, and the creature poises itself, ready to attack one last time. The creature attacks Howard again, and Tanya reaches for the dropped flashlight and breaks the creature's arm. We watch as she now cries in pain and stumbles into the corner. Howard tries the advantage, but is slapped backwards and attacked again. In defense, Howard rips the flesh off the face of the Unnamable, and then the trees join in the fight. Howard tries his advantage and is again slapped away. And then the trees carry the voice of Joshua Winthrop. He calls her Elida and tells her that he has now come for her. Howard and Tanya pull away at the barricades as Elida is dragged away by the trees. She continues to scream in pain as she is pulled out the window, and the two of them escape outside and then share a post-near-death makeout, when all of a sudden something grabs at their feet, pulling Howard into the ground. Skeletal arms are reaching up and try to pull them down further when Carter pulls himself free. He turns to the others and says, "It was hell down there, Howard," and they walk off into the woods as the end credits music plays. Now, yeah, it's a little bit of an anti-climax. You know, the creature just kind of got dragged out the window by the trees. But that's because there is a sequel, The Unnamable 2, The Statement of Randolph Carter, also known as The Unnamable Returns, which came out just a few years later, has a much bigger budget. There's a few extra cast members, including John Rhys-Davies and David Warner. Of course, the two main characters from this film also return, and it's a crazy good sequel, but I'll save all that for another time. So, I don't really have that many favourite scenes from the film because this whole film is a favourite scene. This film on the whole, it's a guilty pleasure for me. Maybe it's because I saw this film at a really young age, and the monster screams and the hidden demon that lurks in the shadows, and this was the first film that I'd ever seen H.P. Lovecraft's name attached to it, and was therefore the film that introduced me into the entire mythos of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, critically, yeah, the film isn't very good, and it was mostly overlooked as a generic, sleazy slasher film with a cool monster. Critics at the time of release were not that impressed with the performances, the script, the music, and they found the film pretty mediocre and boring. The unwatchable, they called it. However, I really like the gothic visual style. I like the old house and the crummy looking cemetery outside, the locked attic door being hammered on with the demonic screams echoing throughout a storm. It's just so very atmospheric. Now, the creature effects are fantastic, and Alexandra did a great job bringing the Unnamable creature to life. Now, what really works best in the film for me is the friendship between Carter and Howard. I only wish they had more scenes together, which they really do in the sequel. I have to recommend both films to any fan of H.P. Lovecraft and the adaptations that followed. Yes, this isn't the best example of those adaptations, but it is serviceable at the very least. The performance by Mark Kinsey Stephenson is one of the many factors I've always loved about this film, and he almost perfectly resembles a more modern H.P. Lovecraft in himself, and I love the fact that he's a geek that saves the day, which was fairly rare for an 80s horror movie. On top of that, you have the gorgeous Laura Albert, and some nice gory kills and some really silly dialogue. There's a lot here to enjoy, so yeah, I easily recommend The Unnamable. It's not for everyone. It's probably only best for those that love the H.P. Lovecraft mythos and those that love late 80s monster movies. And the monster in this film, as I've said, is fantastic. It is kind of in the forgotten gems category, the guilty pleasure category, but there's definitely enough in here for horror fans to really get a kick out of.
I've seen it. I've really seen it. The Unnamable.
Please.
It was hell down there, Howard.
Thanks for watching Off the Shelf Reviews.
Shine a light from the sky.
It's her big tits, isn't it?